Welcome back to Kentucky Ancestors. Before the break, we learned about the ferry that still crosses the Mississippi River between Fulton County and Missouri. And so, Alice, when we were watching that video during break, you actually said you've been on that ferry.
Yes, and I know that gentleman. Yeah, I talked to that gentleman, yeah.
And that's also, though, where your family mystery involved smuggling during the Civil War kind of takes place. So we're going to dig a little more into that story. So according to Fulton County court records, John renewed the ferry rights periodically at the county courthouse. These records describe the location of the ferry as being 1 mile south of town. This location makes perfect sense when viewing where Hickman sits in relation to the river route over to Durena, Missouri. But that's as close as we can get because the ferry itself couldn't be found on any historic maps, oddly enough. So as we heard in the video, the location of the banks of the Mississippi River have fluctuated certainly over the years. But we have evidence that John had a very lucrative business. If this newspaper article advertisement is any indication, so I'm going to have you read a piece of that advertisement.
Boyer's Ferry, we can cross you over in 10 minutes. Special low rates for local trade to Hickman.
Well, look at that. Time sensitive. I mean, he was really crushing the business right there, I guess. When the Civil War broke out, John Boyer tried his best to keep running his ferry, despite tumultuous conditions, as you can imagine, caused by the war. And in fact, control of Hickman switched sides at least a couple of times during the war, right? So your sympathies, I think, would go back and forth. So Alice, next down on your sheet, can you read this notice by Union General Ulysses S. Grant about the conditions of the area near Paducah and Hickman in 1861?
To the citizens of Paducah, I have come among you not as an enemy, but as your friend and fellow citizen. An enemy in rebellion against our common government has taken possession of and planted its guns upon the soil of Kentucky and fired upon our flag. Hickman and Columbus are in his hands. I am here to defend you against this enemy and to assert and maintain the authority and sovereignty of your government and mine.
Well said, right? So by 1863, the Union Army confiscated John Boyer's ferry and took it further north to Columbus in Hickman County. A letter written by one of John's descendants, Nanny Boyer Rice, shares this story. So will you read the items that were confiscated?
One ferry boat, 1,200 bushels of corn, 75 bushels of potatoes, 10 head of horses, 10 or 15 stands of bees, and everything else they could see.
So on July 30th of that same year, John Boyer wrote a letter from Hickman to a Union officer at the fort in Columbus who was in charge of the area. Now, Alice, can you read what John claims?
I am the owner of the horse ferry boat now at Columbus and a loyal citizen of the United States. My ferry boat was seized shortly after the withdrawal of the troops from this place. I shall be glad if you will give an order to me for its restoration, pledging myself that it shall be used for no improper or illegal purposes whatever, as it never was heretofore.
Interesting response. So there's no record of activity from John Boyer about the ferry actually from 1863 to 1866. So it actually appears that the U.S. Army held his boat for most of the war. But to show how complex and confusing life in Kentucky was during this time, John remained in Hickman despite its shifting loyalties, right back and forth. In April of 1864, when U.S. forces were once again attempting to clear out the Confederates, one Union officer charged with evacuating loyal citizens from the city stated, I would say that there are very few loyal citizens in Hickman. The place is decidedly rebel. So, as John Boyer was still residing in Hickman at the time this statement was made, it was really difficult to tell which side John truly supported. So to complicate John's story further, in 1860, he married a woman named America Fleetwood. I actually love that name, America Fleetwood, whose family had known Confederate sympathies. But let's take a moment and go back to the historic account where we examined at the beginning of the show, written by Noma Winston, about quinine smuggling. So our genealogy experts dissected the article that got Alice started on her family history. Here's KHS's head of library and archives, Sherry Daniels, to explain why this step is important and how you can dissect your own family stories prior to planning out your own research.
Most genealogists know that a family story can be one of the best clues we have to take our research in a certain direction. But what should you do when you encounter a family story? It's always important to document the story itself. Write it down exactly as you heard it, or better yet, take an audio recording of your family member relating the story to you. Future generations will thank you for capturing the sound of an ancestor's voice. Then take the story you gathered and dissect it for research clues. Does the story give you a history timestamp to start with, such as date, location, names of those involved? Does it have details that can be corroborated through outside documentation? You need to attempt a research verification of the story. That way, when you pass it down to the next generation, you can either enhance it with documented validation or an alternate storyline based on the research. Keep in mind that family stories can resemble the telephone game we used to play as children. By the time the story gets to you, it may have passed through many generations and shifted versions multiple times. This alteration over time can happen by accident or intentionally in an attempt to protect the reputation of loved ones. If you discover that your family story cannot be validated through research, or worse yet, that the story just doesn't add up in the documentation, it's still important to record the story anyway. Why? Because your family chose to include this story as part of their family narrative. It is a piece of your family's identity that was important enough to pass on to subsequent generations. Besides, future generations may stumble upon the correct details that make the essence of the story true. Pass on what your research revealed, along with the original version.